Welcome to lesson 2.7, division of real numbers. So the goal for today's lesson is obviously to divide real numbers and fractions. Now remember, real numbers can be positives, negatives, zero, fractions, or decimals. Now, in order to divide fractions, you want to remember, and it doesn't matter if we're dealing with positives or negatives, but the process for dividing fractions is to multiply by the reciprocal. And the reciprocal is that fancy way of saying flipping the second fraction. So, in other words, you leave the first fraction, you change from division to multiplication, and you flip the second fraction. So to divide fractions, you multiply by the reciprocal. Then the other part to keep in mind is if we're dealing with negatives and positives, anytime we're multiplying or dividing, if there's an even number of negative signs in the problem, the final answer is positive. For example, a negative divided by a negative has two negative signs, even number gives us a positive. If you have an odd number of negative signs, for example, positive divided by a negative, one negative sign, we get a negative answer. So just like multiplication, a negative divided by a negative gives us a positive. Positive divided by a positive gives us a positive. And if we're dividing one negative and one positive, we always get a negative. Then in example 1, which is just our 6 different pieces that we're looking at for this lesson, they ask us to find each quotient. And remember that term quotient means the solution to a division problem. So in part A, we have 54 divided by a negative 6. So just like division always, 54 divided by 6 is 9. Positive divided by a negative would give us a negative. So 54 divided by negative 6 gives us a negative 9. We could also look at this using our rules to divide fractions and think of 54 as 54 over 1 divided by a negative 6 over 1. Then we would change it from division to multiplication, flip the second, and then it comes out still to be 54 over a negative 6, which is a negative 9. So if we're not dealing with fractions, using these rules just make more work. So we just want to use these two rules here. So then in this case, negative 125 divided by a negative 5. Two negative signs means my answer will be positive. 125 divided by 5 is 25. Then we get into C, which is where we're going to have to start dealing with fractions or mixed numbers. So in C, we have a negative 90 divided by 3 3/5. So a negative 90 is the same as a negative 90 over 1. Any whole number can go over 1. That would be divided by, and we want to change our mixed number into an improper fraction. And the way we do that is the number out in front, 3, times the denominator 5 is 15, plus the 3 on top is 18. So we have 18/5. So then we have the negative 90 over 1 divided by 18 over 5. Following our rules, we leave the first fraction, negative 90 over 1, change division to multiplication, and flip the second fraction. So then 5 over 18. Now if we're multiplying fractions, we can check to cross simplify. The 90 and the 18, or in this case, negative 90, positive 18, can both be divided by 18. 18 goes into itself once. 90 divided by 18 is 5, and the negative stays with it, so it's a negative 5. So what we're really left with is a negative 5 over 1 multiplied by 5 over 1. So a negative 5 times a positive 5 is a negative 25. Then we have D, E, and F. So in D, we're dealing with another whole number and a mixed number. So negative 39 divided by a negative 4 1/3. So the negative 39 over 1 divided by, and we need to convert this into an improper fraction. So 4 times 3 is 12, plus 1 is 13. So we have a negative 13 over 3, because the negative out in front stays with it. Then we need to change our division to multiplication and flip the second fraction. First fraction gets left alone. So multiplying by the reciprocal, we end up with negative 39 over 1 multiplied by negative 3 over 13. Cross simplify 39 and 13. Both can be divided by 13. So the 13 simplifies to a 1, the 39 to the 3. So then on top, we have a negative 3 times a negative 3 over 1 times 1. So we end up with 9 over 1, or a positive 9. In E, we're just dealing with two positive fractions, so we know our answer will be positive. And we're going to multiply by the reciprocal, so 4 over 14 multiplied by 7 over 6. Then we want to cross simplify the 7 and the 14. Both can be divided by 7, so the 14 becomes a 2, 7 becomes a 1. The 4 and 6 both can be simplified by dividing by 2, so the 4 becomes a 2, so the 4 becomes a 2, and the 6 becomes a 3. So in this case, we end up with 2 times 1 on top and 2 times 3 on bottom. 2 times 1 on top is 2. 2 times 3 on bottom is 6. And 2 6 can be further simplified by dividing both by 2, and we end up with 1/3. And then our final example, F. We have a fraction divided by a whole number. So remember, any whole number can be written over 1. So we really have 18 over 5 divided by a negative 3 over 1. So then we're going to follow our rules of dividing fractions and multiply by the reciprocal. So we have 18 over 5 multiplied by the negative 1/3. Cross simplify the 3 and 18. Both can be divided by 3. So we end up with a 1 and a 6. So 6 over 5 multiplied by negative 1 over 1. So then we end up with a negative 6 over 5, which we could also write as the mixed number by taking a group of 5 out of the top. And then we'd have a negative 1 and 1/5. Either answer, the negative 6 over 5 or the negative 1 and 1/5, I would accept. They are equivalent answers. So remember, when you are dividing fractions, you multiply by the reciprocal, so you always leave the first, change from division to multiplication, and flip the second fraction. Otherwise, if you're just dealing with whole numbers, a negative divided by a negative or a positive divided by a positive will always give you a positive. One negative and one positive will always give you a negative. And then when you're multiplying your fractions, First, you can cross simplify, and then you multiply across the top, so numerator times numerator, and then across the bottom, denominator times denominator. Don't cross multiply to solve your fractions. That only works with proportions.